Hello and welcome. You're watching Head to Head on UATV and I'm Oleksandr Khara. The meeting of foreign ministers of the Normandy Four format was planned to be held in the second part of September, but after the self-proclaimed militant leader of the so-called Donetsk People's Republic, Oleksandr Zakharchenko, was killed, this meeting seems to be out of the picture. This is what Russian Minister of Foreign Affairs Sergei Lavrov stated a few days ago. So what does this mean for Ukraine? To talk more about this, we welcome to our studio today Oleksandr Khara, expert on foreign and security policy at the Maidan of Foreign Affairs. Hello, and thank you for being with us, Mr. Khara.
Pleasure to be here.
It's a pleasure to have you here always. Actually, Russia's Minister of Foreign Affairs, Sergei Lavrov, had more to say on the matter. Quote, Zakharchenko's murder is a provocation from Ukraine aimed at disrupting Minsk agreement. And also in the same speech, he mentioned the disrupted Normandy Four. So tell me, what is your take on that? And does Ukraine really have a clear interest in disrupting the Minsk peaceful process?
Well, I think that it's this sort of the Russians' approach, how to use any opportunity to blame everything on Ukraine. Even before Zakharchenko's killing, there has not been a day without shelling, without firing towards Ukrainian side. For the half of the year, at least 50 Ukrainian soldiers has been killed and more wounded. So even before Zakharchenko's death, Russia was not willing to stop the war and to come to the table to negotiate political solution.
Yeah,
so
and to adhere to the Minsk agreements.
So
also.
That's why it's just they are trying to overplay the situation and use it on their advantage. And I think there is no actually connection between the Minsk process and Mr. Zakharchenko, because he is a sort of a Russian puppet presenting so-called republics, but in reality all the decisions are being made in Moscow, and it's not time for Moscow to consider the seizure of their activities in Ukraine and certainly withdrawing from Ukraine. I think in the long term they are preparing for the new advancements in Donbass and in Azov Sea, just on the eve of the elections that we are going to have in Ukraine. So they are going to destabilize the situation in Ukraine, and those so-called separatists are useful tools to achieve this goal.
So this is the scenario for Mr. Poroshenko not to be re-elected for the next term as the president of Ukraine?
Well, I don't think that it's an issue of Poroshenko per se. It's an issue of destabilizing Ukraine. It doesn't matter whether it's pro-Ukrainian forces or moderate forces.
But they want to have the pro-Russian candidate to be elected, probably.
Well, they have in mind this scenario, but it's almost impossible to achieve, because if you have a look at the pro-Russian candidates in Ukrainian opinion polls, they are just sort of marginalized, and there's no way how they can get to the highest office of this country. But what they keep in mind is that they have been doing with the United States and other countries to put these countries into chaos, to show that there is unrest in the country and to destabilize political and certainly economic situation. And that's why they are not putting bets on some names, pro-Russian names in the list of the candidates, but they are trying to undermine Ukrainian sovereignty and stability.
Well, Ukraine's representative in Trilateral Contact Group in Minsk, Irina Gerashchenko, thinks that actually Russia stands behind this assassination, and by doing this, Russia covers its tracks. What's your take on that?
Well, I wish it was Ukrainian special services who killed this enemy, and it would be a legitimate cause. But in reality, I think it's more closer to the Russian special forces, or possibly the economic rivalry of other groups, because the so-called Luhansk and Donetsk republics are controlled by the different special forces of the Russian Federation, and besides all those military activities, they control parts of economy, smuggling of goods, of weapons and other stuff, and that's why from time to time there are some rivalries between the Russians and pro-Russian Ukrainians in such positions. So possibly we can find the economic roots or the illegal economy roots in the killings of Mr. Zakharchenko.
So basically they have some economic confrontation inside of this Donetsk People's Republic Republican and between the oligarchs and between the leaders from the Kremlin and stuff.
That's right, because two groups of people from the military intelligence and from the political intelligence service of Russia are controlling Luhansk and Donetsk, and they had different budgets, they have different vision of their republics, and that's why we haven't seen any merger of these two entities occupied by Russia into the Nova Russia or whatever you call it. So there are different interests of different groups with specific influence on the Kremlin. They are trying to compete for the Kremlin's money, for the Kremlin's political will, and they have plenty of room on this subject.
What are these two groups that we're talking about?
Well, it's a group of people related to the military intelligence and to the political, and Mr. Surkov is one of the ideologists of this war against Ukraine, occupation of Crimea and certainly in Donbass. And he had plenty of people in Donetsk on various levels, but it's symptomatic that before these events unfold, a lot of them were evacuated to Russia, so they are no longer in the common positions in the so-called DNR. So it shows that there are competitive interests, and some groups are losing their attention or favorable attitude of Putin and the cronies around him.
So you mentioned that the aim of this assassination is to interfere in the presidential, upcoming presidential race in Ukraine here.
It will be used, but in reality it's more likely that economic interests between those Russian special forces on the ground who control smuggling and illegal economy and economy
were the first reason of this.
The first reason is the... And at the same time, some observers are saying that Mr. Zakharchenko was trying to play more independent role within the boundaries of the DNR. And by doing this, he just crossed several red lines with his Russian commanders,
yes.
and possibly it's the other case of his murder. It could be his willingness to be more independent within the boundaries.
What can you foresee? Will this conflict escalate or not?
Well, escalation is a tool that Russia would use to destabilize the situation in Ukraine, and it could be done in any way, in any time. It's obviously for the Russians, they cannot proceed further into Ukrainian territory because of Ukrainian armed forces, because of the Ukrainian public support of armed forces, and because of the sanction pressure on Russia. But destabilization or everyday killing of Ukrainian soldiers undermines the morale of Ukrainian soldiers and Ukrainian public, and certainly it's sort of an influence on the general public's attitudes toward the authorities in Kiev. Well, it's obvious that if we have in captivity in Russia Ukrainian citizens, military or civilians like journalist Sentsov and others, it means that the Ukrainian civil society is putting pressure on the Ukrainian government to free these people, and it's in favor of the Russian for the Russians, because they use it as a leverage against the president.
Well, but war always have its losses. The thing that interests me, Russia doesn't want to recognize now Minsk format, Minsk negotiations and Normandy format. Why so? Do they want us to develop some kind of new peaceful negotiations, or what?
Well, if you have a look at the memoirs of the former French President François Hollande, and he was describing the Minsk process and how this agreement has been forged, Putin was trying to put amount of pressure on Mr. Poroshenko, saying that we will smash Ukrainian forces. And it's until after Chancellor Merkel said that the West would put a huge amount of pressure on Russia in terms of sanctions and other, and he agreed on such an agreement. But he has never tried to obey this agreement, simply because it's not in his interest. If we have a look at the points of this agreement, the first point is to stop. It's a ceasefire, to stop to killing each other, then withdrawal of the heavy armaments from the contact line, and then in the middle of this agreement we see these political settlement issues. The Russians are trying to read this agreement in a different way, that we can kill you Meanwhile, you should implement the amendments to your constitution limiting the Ukrainian ability to become a member of NATO, the European Union. That's why one part of the first part of the agreement is the interest for Ukraine to stop the war and to begin the political process. And the Russians are interested in the second part of limiting Ukrainian sovereignty by imposing the Finland model or other type of models on in the Ukrainian constitution. So that's why the Russians are not interested in implementing it, because they see that the price of the aggression is not so high. And they have not
It's not so high or not so low?
It's not so high so far. Yes, there are a huge amount of sanctions, but the buffer that the oil dollars buffer that the Russians have help them to withstand this pressure. And they believe they can undermine the Western alliance, I mean the unity and integrity of the European alliance and the transatlantic unity. In the long run, they can get what they want, the Ukraine back into the sphere of their influence, and in exchange for some more soft approach towards Europeans or the Americans.
So what you mean is that the sanctions are not that much efficient?
Well, they're efficient, they're harmful, they are painful, but Russia is a different animal to the Western countries, because it's not a democratic country, and there is no correspondence between the will of people and those who are in power.
Of course.
If you imagine any such a sanction imposed to the United States or Britain or Poland, any government would be overthrown because of the angry people.
Yeah, because of the protests. And
that's right. And Russia is different country. We have actually, there is no civil society, at least the viable civil society that is capable of bringing a change. There is no free media that can tell the truth to the Russians, that the Russians are fighting against Ukrainians in Ukraine or against Syrians or in Georgia or whatever. Then there is no separate branches of power. Because if we are talking about the legislative branch, it's controlled by Putin, by the Kremlin. If we are talking about judicial branch of power, they are just signing anything that the Kremlin administration is sending to them. So there is no checks and balances that can change the situation. And that's why all this hardship that the Russian people are experiencing after the illegal annexation of Crimea, war in Ukraine, poisoning of Mr. Skripal by chemical agents in Britain, or other let's say, misdoings of Mr. Putin. They just, it's not up to them to change this course.
In your opinion, what can break this bubble? Because this Russia looks like a bubble. It's all covered with all the barriers, and basically everything is in control of Mr. Putin.
Well, there are some signs of dissatisfaction of the Russians. First and foremost, with regard to the pension reform, and it's not Ukraine which is far away. It's not the Western sanctions, which possibly sometimes the Western sanctions are not so harmful as the Russian counter-sanctions. But it's the domestic economic dynamics that is undermining Putin's role. And secondly, each and every war needs a lot of resources, people and money. And since the Western sanctions are working pretty good, but the effect, the real effect would be felt by the Russians in the long run, so the Russians are running out of money, resources to wage this war. And that's why it's so important to keep this sanctions front against the Russians and impose more sanctions on more violations, on more misdoings of Mr. Putin.
Well, thank you so much for these clear answers. It was a pleasure to have you in the studio.
Thank you for having me.
That was Oleksandr Khara, expert on foreign and security policy at the Maidan of Foreign Affairs. Thank you for watching, and stay tuned with UATV.